Stop acting like a victim and move out. My daughter said those words while my husband's funeral flowers were still sitting on the dining room table. The white lilies hadn't even started to wilt yet. Frank had been buried only 3 hours earlier, and the black dress I wore still smelled faintly like church incense and cold November air. Vanessa stood across from me in my own kitchen with her arms folded tightly against her chest, her expression flat and impatient, like this conversation was an inconvenience she had been rehearsing all day. Her husband Daniel stayed near the refrigerator pretending to check his phone, refusing to look directly at me. I remember staring at the casserole dishes neighbors had dropped off that afternoon. Tuna noodle, baked ziti, chicken potpia. Meals meant to comfort grieving families. But nothing about that kitchen felt comforting anymore. Mom, this house is too much for you now, Vanessa continued, her voice calmer than it should have been. Dad's gone. You need to stop clinging to the past. I looked toward the hallway without answering. Frank's reading glasses were still sitting on the small wooden table beside the living room recliner. That morning before the funeral, I had almost picked them up to clean them out of habit. 39 years of marriage creates strange reflexes. Even after death, your body still expects the person you love to walk through the front door at any moment. I'm not discussing this tonight, I finally said quietly. Vanessa let out a sharp breath through her nose. That's exactly the problem. You keep acting helpless so everyone feels sorry for you. The words settled into the room like ice. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just clarity. A cold, heavy clarity I couldn't ignore anymore. Earlier that afternoon at the cemetery, Vanessa had cried loudly enough for everyone to hear her. She held on to people dramatically, dabbing at dry eyes with tissues she never actually used. But now her voice sounded impatient, almost irritated that my grief had become an obstacle standing between her and whatever future she had already planned for herself. Daniel finally spoke. Without lifting his eyes from his screen. Maybe assisted living wouldn't be a bad idea. Assisted living. Less than 4 hours after lowering my husband into the ground, I folded the dish towel in my hands slowly, carefully smoothing the wrinkles from the fabric, just to give myself something steady to focus on. Frank used to tease me about that habit. You iron dish towels better than most people iron dress shirts, he'd laugh. For a second I could almost hear his voice again. Vanessa stepped closer to the kitchen island. Honestly, Mom, staying here alone is unhealthy. Daniel and I already talked to a realtor friend who said the market is perfect right now. Realtor. The word hit me harder than anything else she'd said. My eyes finally lifted to hers. There was no grief there. No hesitation. Only calculation. That was the moment I understood this conversation hadn't started after the funeral. It had started long before Frank died. Maybe weeks before. Maybe months. Maybe while I was still sitting beside my husband's hospital bed, believing my daughter was holding my hand because she loved me. I said nothing after that. I simply turned off the kitchen light and walked upstairs to the bedroom Frank and I had shared for nearly 4 decades. But when I opened the garage door an hour later looking for an old blanket, I found 3 cardboard boxes sitting near the wall with black marker written across the sides. Donate. And inside those boxes were my clothes. I stood in the garage for a long time staring at those boxes. The overhead light buzzed softly above me, casting pale yellow shadows across the concrete floor. Donate. Vanessa had written the word in thick black marker, like she was labeling old Christmas decorations instead of my life. I crouched slowly beside the nearest box and lifted the top flap with trembling fingers. Inside was the blue wool sweater Frank bought me during our anniversary trip to Vermont 15 years ago. I remembered the tiny bookstore where we stopped to warm up after walking through freezing rain. The owner had hot cider simmering near the register, and Frank insisted the sweater matched my eyes even though I told him I was too old for compliments like that. Beneath the sweater sat framed photographs wrapped in newspaper. My wedding picture. A family photo from Disneyland when Vanessa was 12. Even the ceramic angel my sister gave me after Frank's first heart surgery had been stuffed into the corner beneath an old scarf. Someone had not simply packed my belongings. Someone had sorted through them carefully, deliberately. Upstairs I could hear muffled voices moving through the house. Cabinet doors opening. Footsteps crossing the hardwood floors. Vanessa's laughter drifted faintly through the air for half a second before disappearing again. It sounded strangely normal, almost cheerful. That was the part that hurt the most. My husband had been dead for less than 24 hours, and somehow life was already becoming easier for everyone except me. I sat down slowly on the small folding chair beside Frank's old workbench. His tools still hung neatly on the pegboard exactly where he left them. The hammer with the red handle. The measuring tape he refused to replace even after it cracked. A coffee mug stained dark from years of use rested beside a stack of screws sorted into baby food jars. Frank loved order. He used to joke that even his nails had assigned parking spots. I pressed my fingertips against the sleeve of the sweater in my lap, and finally allowed myself to breathe. Not cry. Just breathe. The house no longer sounded like my home. It sounded like a place being prepared for someone else. The next morning I woke before sunrise out of habit. For 39 years Frank always made coffee at 6 sharp. I could practically hear the familiar grinding sound from downstairs before I fully opened my eyes. But when I reached across the bed, my hand touched nothing except cold sheets and empty space. I stayed there for several minutes staring at the ceiling while pale winter light crept through the curtains. Eventually I forced myself downstairs. Vanessa was already in the kitchen wearing expensive cream-colored workout clothes and scrolling through her phone while eating yogurt at the island. She barely looked up when I entered. "Morning," she said flatly. There was no softness in her voice. Anymore. No careful pretending. I reached automatically for the coffee mugs Frank and I always used, but halfway through opening the cabinet I stopped myself. "Only 1 cup now." Vanessa noticed. "You should probably start simplifying things," she said casually. "There is no reason to keep so much clutter around anymore." Clutter. That was what 39 years had become. I poured my coffee carefully and sat near the window overlooking the backyard. Frank's garden looked abandoned already. The roses drooped beneath the cold November frost, and leaves covered the stone path he used to sweep every Sunday morning. Vanessa continued tapping at her phone for another minute before speaking again. "A realtor is coming by tomorrow afternoon just to evaluate the property," she said. "Nothing official yet." I looked at her then. Really looked at her. My daughter's blonde hair was pulled into the same neat ponytail she wore as a little girl when I packed her lunches before school. For one strange second I saw both versions of her at once. The child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and the woman now discussing the sale of my home while her father's funeral flowers still sat wilting in the dining room. "Tomorrow?" I asked quietly. Vanessa finally met my eyes. "Mom, we need to start being realistic." And just like that I realized they were not waiting for me to grieve. They were waiting for me to leave. The realtor arrived the next afternoon at exactly 2:15. I remember because I had been staring at the kitchen clock ever since Vanessa mentioned the appointment that morning. The second hand seemed louder than usual, ticking through the silence while cold rain tapped softly against the windows. I sat in the living room wearing one of Frank's old cardigans wrapped tightly around my shoulders even though the furnace was running. The house smelled faintly like lilies and furniture polish. Vanessa had spent most of the morning cleaning countertops and opening curtains, as if she were preparing for a holiday gathering, instead of evaluating the home where her father had spent the last days of his life. When the doorbell rang, she hurried to answer it before I could stand. "Rachel, thank you so much for coming," I heard her say brightly. Her voice sounded warm in a way it never sounded with me anymore. The realtor walked into the house carrying a leather folder and a tablet tucked beneath her arm. She looked around quickly with the trained eyes of someone measuring value instead of memories. "Beautiful property," she said politely. "Homes in this neighborhood are moving fast right now." Vanessa smiled proudly. Proudly. As if she already owned the place. I stayed seated while they walked through the dining room discussing square footage and renovation potential. Renovation potential. That was the phrase Rachel used while standing beside the china cabinet Frank built for me by hand 30 years ago. I remembered sanding those wooden shelves together in the garage while music played from an old radio balanced on paint cans. Frank accidentally stained his wedding ring dark brown that weekend and joked that he finally matched the furniture. Now strangers were discussing whether the cabinet should be removed to create a more open modern feel. I folded my hands tighter in my lap and listened quietly. At one point Rachel glanced toward me with an awkward smile. And where are you planning to relocate, Mrs. Carter? Relocate. Such a clean, harmless word. Like I was choosing a vacation destination instead of being slowly erased from my own life. Before I could answer, Vanessa stepped in smoothly. We are looking at some really nice senior communities nearby. Somewhere quieter and easier to manage. We. Not she. We. I noticed that immediately. Every decision had somehow become collective except the one person actually losing her home. Rachel nodded sympathetically. That makes sense. Maintenance can become overwhelming. I almost laughed at that. Frank and I spent nearly 4 decades taking care of this house ourselves. We painted every wall, repaired every storm shutter, built the garden stone by stone during summer so hot the concrete burned through our sneakers. There was nothing overwhelming about this house to me. The overwhelming part was watching my daughter discuss my future with complete strangers while avoiding my eyes entirely. After the realtor finally left, Vanessa remained unusually cheerful. She poured herself sparkling water and leaned against the kitchen counter scrolling through photos Rachel had taken on her phone. If we repaint the downstairs and update the appliances, this place could easily go for $800,000, she said casually. $800,000. She spoke about my home the same way people discuss stock prices. I carried my coffee cup slowly to the sink without responding. As I rinsed it under warm water, I noticed something small but strange near the refrigerator. A yellow legal pad covered in Vanessa's handwriting. Most of it was grocery lists and phone numbers, but one line near the bottom made my stomach tighten instantly. Storage unit for Mom's furniture. Underneath it was another note written in darker ink. Estate attorney Thursday at 10. I stared at those words for several seconds while water continued running over my hands. Estate attorney. Not realtor. Attorney. Suddenly every conversation from the past 2 days rearranged itself inside my head like puzzle pieces finally locking together. This was never about helping me move. This was about ownership. About money. About making sure everything Frank spent his entire life building passed smoothly into their hands. And for the first time since the funeral, I began to wonder whether my husband had seen this coming before I did. That night, I waited until the house was quiet before going into Frank's study. The room sat at the end of the hallway behind a dark oak door that Vanessa had not touched yet, probably because she still thought it contained nothing more than old paperwork and dusty books. Frank spent hours in that room during the last few years of his life, especially after retirement. Sometimes he would sit in there long after midnight balancing checkbooks or reading articles on his tablet, while soft jazz played through the tiny speaker near the bookshelf. I used to tease him that he treated paperwork like a second career. Somebody has to keep this family organized, he would say with that calm smile of his. The study still smelled faintly like cedarwood and black coffee when I stepped inside. For a moment, I simply stood there letting the silence settle around me. His reading lamp remained angled toward the leather chair beside the window. A sweater still hung across the armrest exactly where he left it after his final hospital visit. I reached down and touched the fabric gently before moving farther into the room. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows while the old grandfather clock downstairs chimed 10 o'clock. The house sounded hollow now, as if every room understood something terrible had shifted inside these walls. I sat carefully behind Frank's desk and opened the top drawer. Pens, receipts, envelopes sorted neatly with handwritten labels. Everything exactly the way he always kept it. Frank believed important things should never be difficult to find. First, I was not looking for anything specific. I only wanted to feel close to him again somehow. But then I noticed a small brass key taped beneath the inside corner of the drawer. My breath caught instantly. Frank was methodical. If he hid something, there was a reason. I peeled the tape away slowly and turned the key over in my palm. Tiny numbers had been engraved into the metal beside the words First National Bank. My heart began beating harder. Beneath the key sat a cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in Frank's careful handwriting. Helen. Just seeing his handwriting again made my throat tighten painfully. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded the letter inside. Helen, if you are reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. I stopped breathing for a second. The rain outside suddenly sounded louder. I continued reading slowly, forcing myself to focus through the blur forming in my eyes. I know you trust people because that is who you are. But trust does not always survive grief. There are documents at the bank that you may need someday. Promise me you will not ignore your instincts if something feels wrong after I am gone. I leaned back heavily in the chair staring at the page. Frank knew. Somehow he knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough to leave this behind. Enough to prepare for the possibility that I would one day need protection from my own family. My eyes drifted toward the bookshelf beside the desk where framed photographs lined the shelves. Vanessa at her college graduation smiling beside Frank in a blue cap and gown. Christmas mornings. Beach vacations. Birthday dinners. We looked like a normal American family in every picture. Warm. Happy. Safe. But suddenly I began remembering small moments I had ignored over the years. Vanessa asking strange questions about property taxes after Frank's first heart attack. Her comments about how large the house was becoming for just two older people. The way she started offering to organize our financial paperwork whenever Frank became sick. At the time I thought she was trying to help. That is the dangerous thing about betrayal. It rarely arrives looking cruel in the beginning. Usually it arrives smiling politely while carrying grocery bags through your front door. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I looked again at the brass bank key resting in my hand beneath the soft yellow desk lamp. For the first time since Frank's funeral, I no longer felt confused. I felt afraid. But underneath the fear, something else had started growing quietly inside me. Awareness. And once awareness arrives, it becomes impossible to return to innocence again. The next morning, I left the house before Vanessa woke up. Dawn had barely broken over the neighborhood, and a thin layer of frost covered the lawns along our street. I stood quietly in the hallway for a moment pulling on my winter coat while listening to the silence inside the house. Frank used to wake before sunrise every day no matter the season. By 6 o'clock, he would already be reading the newspaper with coffee brewing in the kitchen. The absence of those sounds felt heavier than grief itself sometimes. It felt unnatural, like the entire rhythm of the house had stopped breathing. I slipped the brass key into my coat pocket and walked outside without turning on any lights. My old sedan sat in the driveway beneath damp maple leaves, but when I tried the ignition, the engine clicked weakly before dying again. I closed my eyes for a second, gripping the steering wheel while cold air seeped through the cracked windows. Frank normally handled things like dead batteries, flat tires, oil changes, tiny emergencies that suddenly felt enormous when faced alone. After the third failed attempt, I finally stepped back onto the sidewalk and pulled my scarf tighter around my neck. The bus stop sat 3 blocks away near the pharmacy. I had not ridden a city bus in nearly 20 years. Frank always insisted on driving whenever we went downtown together because he hated public transportation schedules. As I walked slowly through the freezing morning air, I kept replaying his letter in my mind. Trust does not always survive grief. The words followed me like footsteps. The bus arrived nearly 10 minutes late with a long hiss of brakes and wet pavement. Inside smelled faintly like rain-soaked coats and burnt coffee. I sat near the back holding my purse tightly in my lap, while the city moved past the windows in gray November colors. Small diners opening for breakfast. Men in reflective construction jackets carrying coffee cups. Elderly couples walking carefully through grocery store parking lots. Life continuing normally while mine quietly unraveled. First National Bank occupied a tall stone building downtown near the courthouse. Frank trusted old institutions. Old banks. Old doctors. Old habits. He believed stability mattered more than appearances. I stood for several seconds outside the entrance staring at the brass doors before finally stepping inside. The lobby was warm and smelled faintly like polished marble and printer ink. A young teller greeted me politely from behind the counter. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" My voice sounded smaller than usual when I answered. "My husband recently passed away. I believe he may have left a safety deposit box." Even saying the words "husband passed away" still felt unreal. The teller's expression softened immediately. "I am very sorry for your loss." She asked for identification and disappeared briefly into a back office before returning with a man in a dark gray suit who introduced himself as Mr. Bennett, the branch manager. Frank always appreciated people who wore Brupe suites. He said it showed respect for responsibility. Mr. Bennett guided me downstairs into a quiet vault room lined with metal boxes from floor to ceiling. My hands trembled slightly as I handed him the brass key. He looked at it once and nodded. Mr. Carter arranged special instructions regarding this box several years ago, he explained carefully. Several years ago. My chest tightened instantly. Mr. Bennet unlocked the box and slid it toward me before stepping discreetly outside the room for privacy. For a moment, I simply stared at the small metal drawer resting in front of me beneath the fluorescent lights. Then I opened it slowly. Inside sat several thick folders secured neatly with labeled tabs in Frank's handwriting. Property deed. Trust documents. Legal directives. Beneath them rested a sealed envelope marked open immediately if Helen is asked to leave the house. I stopped breathing completely. My fingers hovered over the envelope while a strange calm settled over me for the first time since the funeral. Frank had known. Not feared. Known. And suddenly I realized something even more frightening than betrayal itself. My husband had spent years quietly preparing for the possibility that one day I would need protection from our own daughter. My hands remained perfectly still as I opened the envelope, but inside my chest, something felt like it had cracked wide open. The paper inside was thick and formal, stamped with the letterhead of a law office I recognized immediately. Parker and Green Estate Attorneys. Frank had used them for years. I unfolded the document slowly beneath the bright vault lights while my wedding ring tapped softly against the paper. Helen, if this envelope has been opened, then someone has either pressured you to leave your home or attempted to interfere with the terms of my estate. Please understand this clearly before you doubt yourself for even 1 second. You are not imagining things. I closed my eyes briefly after reading that sentence. For days I had questioned my own instincts. Grief makes everything feel uncertain. You start wondering whether exhaustion is making you paranoid, whether loneliness is twisting harmless comments into something crueler than they are. But Frank knew me too well for that. He knew I would second-guess myself before accusing anyone I loved. Beneath the letter sat several legal documents clipped neatly together. The first was the deed to our home. Not Frank Carter. Not joint ownership. My name alone appeared on the paperwork. Helen Carter, sole property holder. I stared at the words for several long seconds while my heartbeat echoed loudly in my ears. Frank transferred the house entirely into my name 3 years earlier. 3 years. Around the same time Vanessa had suddenly become interested in helping organize our finances. Around the same time she began mentioning retirement communities during casual family dinners. My fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. The second folder contained trust documents. Detailed. Organized. Precise. Frank had created an irrevocable trust protecting nearly all major assets including investment accounts, savings, and property rights. But it was the final clause that made my stomach drop completely. Any beneficiary found attempting to coerce, manipulate, or force Helen Carter from her primary residence shall immediately forfeit all inheritance rights under this trust. I read the sentence twice to make sure I understood it correctly. Then a third time. Vanessa did not simply lack authority over the house. If Frank's attorneys determined she had attempted to pressure me into leaving, she could lose everything. Every account. Every inheritance payment. Everything. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Mr. Bennet stood quietly outside the vault room. Mrs. Carter, he asked gently, there is also a recorded video message your husband requested be released only under specific circumstances. If you would like, I can arrange a private office for you to view it. My throat tightened instantly. A video. Frank hated cameras. Every Christmas morning he used to complain when Vanessa filmed family dinners for social media. Some moments are supposed to stay real, he always said. I nodded silently and followed Mr. Bennet upstairs into a small office overlooking downtown streets slick with rain. He handed me a tablet. Before quietly closing the door behind him, for several seconds I could not press play. Seeing old photographs already hurt enough. Hearing Frank's voice again felt impossible. Finally I touched the screen. The image flickered once before Frank appeared sitting in his study wearing the navy sweater I bought him 2 birthdays earlier. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. But calm. Hi, sweetheart, he said softly. Just hearing those 2 words nearly destroyed me. I covered my mouth instantly as tears blurred my vision. Frank smiled sadly through the screen. If you are watching this, then things unfolded exactly the way I feared they might. He paused briefly, glancing down at something off camera before continuing. I need you to listen carefully. You are stronger than you think you are. And no matter what anyone tells you, that house belongs to you. I made certain of it. I pressed trembling fingers against my forehead while tears slid silently down my cheeks. If anyone tries to force you out, Frank continued calmly, they lose everything. Do not protect people who are trying to erase you, Helen. Promise me that. The video ended a few moments later, but I remained frozen in the chair staring at the dark screen long after his face disappeared. Outside the office window, people hurried through the cold city streets carrying umbrellas and coffee cups, completely unaware that my entire world had just shifted. When I finally stood up, I no longer felt like a grieving widow being pushed aside by her own daughter. For the first time since the funeral, I understood something clearly. Frank had not left me helpless. He had left me protected. When I returned home that afternoon, the house looked exactly the same from the outside. The white shutters, the brick walkway Frank installed himself one summer after watching too many home improvement shows. The small American flag near the porch fluttering weakly in the cold wind. Everything appeared normal, but I no longer walked toward the front door feeling uncertain. I walked toward it understanding the truth. Vanessa opened the door before I reached for my keys. Where were you? She asked immediately. Not worried. Not relieved. Suspicious. I slipped my gloves off slowly and hung my coat beside the hallway closet. Downtown, I answered calmly. I needed some time alone. Her eyes narrowed briefly before she forced a small smile that never quite reached her face. Well, Daniel and I were talking, and we think it would be best if we all sat down tonight and discussed a timeline. A timeline. Funny how quickly grief becomes scheduling for people eager to move on. I walked into the kitchen without responding. The funeral flowers looked worse now, their white petals beginning to curl brown around the edges. Someone had moved Frank's framed memorial photo off the dining room table and placed it near the window beside a stack of unopened sympathy cards. I noticed these things immediately because Frank's presence was disappearing from the house piece by piece, almost as if Vanessa was quietly redecorating him out of existence. Daniel sat at the kitchen island working on his laptop. He gave me a brief nod before returning to the screen. Neither of them asked if I had eaten. Neither asked how I was holding up after burying my husband less than a week earlier. Instead, Vanessa opened a notebook already filled with bullet points and crossed out dates. Okay, she said brightly while sitting across from me. I found 3 senior living communities within 20 miles that have immediate openings. Immediate openings. Like she had been researching this for some time already. She slid brochures across the table toward me with smiling photographs of elderly couples playing cards and gardening beneath carefully staged sunshine. Golden Meadows Retirement Village. Maple Grove Senior Living. Autumn Pines Community. The names all sounded strangely interchangeable, like products lined up on grocery store shelves. I looked quietly at the glossy pictures while Vanessa continued talking. They have transportation services, meal plans, fitness classes. Honestly, Mom, you would probably be happier around people your own age. Your own age. The phrase settled heavily between us. I remembered when Vanessa was 7 years old and cried every morning before 2nd grade because she hated riding the school bus alone. Frank spent 2 straight weeks driving behind the bus in his truck all the way to school just so she would stop being afraid. We never told her that. Parents protect their children quietly most of the time. That is what love looks like when it is real. I am not moving into a retirement community, I said calmly. Vanessa blinked in surprise, almost like she genuinely expected immediate surrender. Mom, be realistic. Maintaining this property is expensive. The property is already maintained. My voice remained steady. And paid for. Daniel finally looked up from his laptop then. Just for a second. A quick glance toward Vanessa before looking away again. Small reactions become very noticeable once you understand people are hiding something. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms tightly. You cannot stay here forever by yourself. Forever. Another interesting word. I stayed here with your father for nearly 40 years, I answered softly. I think I can manage a few more months. Her jaw tightened immediately. The polite mask slipped for only a second, but I saw it clearly now. Frustration. Impatience. Fear. Not fear for me. fear that something was not unfolding according to plan anymore. That evening after dinner, I passed the downstairs office and overheard their voices through the partially closed door. What if she refuses? Daniel whispered sharply. Vanessa lowered her voice, but not enough. She does not have a choice. Once the estate lawyer finalizes everything, the house becomes ours anyway. I stopped walking instantly. My hand tightened around the hallway banister while cold realization settled through me like winter ice. They still believed the house belonged to them. They had no idea Frank had already changed everything years ago. And suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare began, I understood something important. The most powerful person in a room is usually the one holding the truth quietly while everyone else keeps talking. The following morning, I woke before anyone else and stood alone in the backyard holding a steaming cup of coffee between both hands. The air smelled damp and cold, carrying the sharp scent of wet leaves and earth after overnight rain. Frank loved mornings like this. He used to stand exactly where I was standing now, still wearing his robe, talking about how peaceful the neighborhood felt before everyone started their engines and lawn mowers and leaf blowers. I stared at the garden quietly while pale sunlight pushed through the clouds in thin silver streaks. The roses looked tired beneath the frost, their petals curling inward against the cold. Frank planted those bushes the summer Vanessa graduated college. He said roses required patience because they looked fragile while quietly surviving almost anything. At the time I thought he was only talking about flowers. Behind me I heard the sliding glass door open. Vanessa stepped onto the patio carrying her phone and a folder tucked beneath one arm. "You are up early," she said casually. I nodded once without turning around. She hesitated before sitting at the patio table beside me. "I spoke with the estate attorney yesterday," she began carefully. "There are some documents that still need signatures." I took another slow sip of coffee. "What kind of documents?" "Mostly probate paperwork. Nothing complicated." Probate. Interesting choice of words considering the trust documents specifically avoided probate altogether. Frank planned everything carefully. He hated legal confusion. Vanessa continued speaking while opening the folder. "The attorney said it would help speed things along if we handled the house transfer quickly." House transfer. There it was again. That quiet assumption beneath every conversation. She slid several papers across the table toward me along with a silver pen. "You can look them over after breakfast." I glanced down briefly without touching anything. Most of the pages were covered in dense legal language and highlighted signature tabs. But one phrase near the bottom immediately caught my attention. Voluntary relocation agreement. My fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug. So this was the plan. Convince the grieving widow to sign away her rights while she was emotionally exhausted and too overwhelmed to ask questions. I remembered something Frank used to say. Whenever salespeople pressured him into quick decisions, anyone rushing your signature usually benefits from your confusion. At the time I laughed whenever he said things like that. Frank trusted very few people with money. Apparently he had good reason. "I am not signing anything today," I said calmly. Vanessa's smile disappeared instantly. "Mom, this is not some conspiracy." "I did not say it was." "Then why are you making everything harder than it needs to be?" Harder. Such a revealing word. As though my existence itself had become an obstacle slowing down their plans. I finally looked directly at her. There were dark circles beneath her eyes now, and for the first time since the funeral, she looked nervous instead of confident. "Good. I would like my own attorney to review these first," I said softly. Vanessa stared at me in complete silence for several seconds. Behind her calm expression, I could almost see calculations shifting rapidly inside her mind. This was not the reaction she expected. She thought grief had weakened me. She thought loneliness had made me dependent. Instead, every conversation seemed to make her more uncertain. "Dad already had an attorney," she replied carefully. "There is no need to involve more people." That sentence alone told me everything. Frank's attorney already knew the truth, which meant Vanessa was trying to avoid him. "I think there is," I answered quietly. She stood abruptly from the patio chair, gathering the papers too quickly. One sheet slipped sideways, exposing handwritten notes in the margin. "Realtor estimate after relocation." I pretended not to notice while Vanessa shoved the pages back into the folder. Fine, she snapped softly. But delaying this is only going to create more stress for everyone. Everyone. Another interesting word. Because somehow everyone always seemed to mean everyone except me. She walked back inside without another glance, the sliding door shutting sharply behind her. I remained alone on the patio listening to the quiet creak of tree branches overhead. Then I reached into my coat pocket and touched the folded business card Mr. Bennett had given me the day before. Robert Greene. Estate. Attorney. Frank's attorney. Slowly, for the first time in days, I began understanding exactly why my husband prepared so carefully before he died. He knew love could blind people, but paperwork never does. 2 days later, I invited Vanessa and Daniel to dinner. The moment the words left my mouth that morning, I saw visible relief wash across Vanessa's face. She tried to hide it behind polite concern, but after days of tension, she suddenly moved around the kitchen lighter and faster, humming quietly while checking recipes on her phone. In her mind, the dinner meant surrender. She thought grief had finally exhausted me enough to cooperate. That evening, I cooked every dish Frank loved most. Pot roast with carrots and onions slow-cooked for hours until the meat fell apart beneath the fork. Buttered rolls warmed in the oven. Green beans with almonds. Apple pie cooling beside the stove. The familiar smells filled the house exactly the way they had during hundreds of family dinners over the years. For a few moments while setting the table, I almost forgot everything that had happened. I placed Frank's photograph at the center beside a small candle in a glass holder. Vanessa noticed immediately when she entered the dining room wearing a cream-colored sweater and careful makeup. "This is nice," she said softly, glancing around the room. Nice. Such a small word for a funeral dinner disguised as a negotiation. Daniel opened a bottle of red wine while Vanessa carried salad bowls to the table with exaggerated gentleness, almost like she was trying to return temporarily to the role of loving daughter. We ate quietly at first. Forks against plates. Ice shifting softly in glasses. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows while wind rattled the bare tree branches beyond the backyard fence. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa finally cleared her throat and folded her napkin carefully beside her plate. "Mom," she began cautiously, "Daniel and I have been thinking." Of course they had. "We know this transition has been emotional for you," she continued, "but we really believe moving somewhere smaller would help you start fresh." Start fresh. As though grief was simply clutter needing organization. I cut another small piece of roast beef without responding. Vanessa leaned slightly forward. "Actually, we already found a beautiful condo about 15 minutes away. It is quiet, safe, and perfect for one person." One person. Funny how quickly a lifetime shrinks after widowhood. Daniel finally joined in. "The realtor thinks this house could sell before Christmas." There it was again. The house sale. Always circling back to that. I set my fork down carefully beside my plate and reached for my water glass. "You both seem very confident about the future of this house," I said calmly. Vanessa smiled faintly. "Dad would want everything handled practically." I looked at Frank's photograph for several seconds before answering. "Your father planned more carefully than either of you realize." Silence settled instantly across the table. Vanessa's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "What does that mean?" she asked slowly. I stood from my chair and walked quietly into the study. My hands felt steady now. Strange how fear disappears once truth finally settles into place. When I returned to the dining room, I carried a thick manila folder beneath my arm. Vanessa's eyes immediately locked onto it. Daniel stopped chewing altogether. I sat back down and placed the folder carefully beside my plate without opening it yet. "I met with Robert Greene yesterday," I said softly. The color drained from Vanessa's face so quickly it almost startled me. She knew that name. Of course she did. Frank's attorney had handled our estate planning for years. "Mom," she began quickly, "there is no reason to involve lawyers right now." "Actually," I interrupted gently, "your father already involved lawyers years ago." Nobody moved. The candle beside Frank's photograph flickered softly, while rain continued tapping against the windows. I opened the folder slowly and removed the property deed first, sliding it across the table toward Vanessa. Her eyes scanned the page once before freezing completely. Helen Carter. Sole property holder. I watched realization hit her in stages. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then fear. Real fear. Daniel leaned closer, reading over her shoulder while the silence around the table thickened almost unbearably. Finally Vanessa looked up at me with wide, panicked eyes. "This cannot be right," she whispered. I folded my hands calmly in my lap and held her gaze for the first time in days without looking away. "Your father made sure it was."